Good afternoon. Welcome to JTA. We're excited to see you here this Friday afternoon. So this is the P-19-027 U2C corridor transit-oriented development interview with GAI Consultants. We're just going to go through our safety message. We'll do some introductions and go to the format of this, and then we'll get started. So. Safety message for the month is when you gamble with safety, you bet your life. And on that note, we do have emergency exits out this door, one immediately to the right, and then one past the elevators on the right. We have women's restaurant. Women's restrooms. I must be hungry. Restrooms on this side of the elevators and men's on the other side, along with water fountains. And then if we need to exit the back of the building, there's emergency exit out that way as well. So we'll go ahead and go through introductions. My name is John Burdine. I'm the Contracts and Procurement Specialist with JTA.
I'm Carolyn Ellen Smith, Contracts and Procurement Specialist with JTA.
Kendra Burton, Manager of Financial Planning and Analysis.
Zan Traversa, Planning and System Development in the TOD Planner.
Hi, Alicia Batson. I'm a Senior Manager in the Public Affairs Office.
Cleveland Ferguson, CAO.
And we'll have Andre Wallace also join us here in a few minutes. So, if you guys want to go through introductions real quick, and then we'll get started after that.
Sure. I'll start. My name's Blake Drury, and I'm with GAI Consultants.
Nick Musa with GAI Consultants.
Owen Beich with GAI Consultants.
I'm Troy Russ with Kimley Horn.
Clarence Ng with Kimley Horn.
Amira Saeed with Ecosys LLC.
Pete Seckler with GAI.
Thank you. This is intended to be an interview type process, so dialogue goes in both ways. You guys can ask questions if you'd like. We can do the same. We've got 2 hours, and the time is 12:05, so we have till 2:05. And I'll go ahead and start you there.
Great. So thanks everybody for taking this time to talk with us about something that you'll see is near and dear to our heart, and we think is really important to the future not only of JTA but Jacksonville in transit-oriented development. As I said before, my name is Blake Drury, and I'm a project manager with GAI. I have worked with Nick Musa, who's our client liaison here in Jacksonville, for the past 5 years on a number of projects throughout the state. And when we work in Jacksonville, one of the things we recognize is that we need to bring the best team that we possibly can to bear. You'll see through our history, have a great deal of experience helping cities and agencies to deliver TOD, which I think will be one of the things we want to underscore today, is that ability to deliver the product. And as we've looked around, we put together a team that I think has an experience that really fits what you're looking to try to do with your program. So you have asked us a few questions, 7 or 8. We like to be direct, and so we're going to structure our presentation as answers to those questions. We're happy if you want to pause and ask a clarification or a question. We'll answer it the best we can. We're pretty good at being flexible, and I think you'll see that today. So going through the team and the org chart that we've put together, again, I'm the project manager. I'm based in Orlando, so I'm a couple hours down the road, but I'm here 3 or 4 times a month. I was telling the guys that the last time I was in this office, because we were working on the La Villa development strategy, I needed to come up for a 45-minute face-to-face meeting with Mr. Ford, so I put everything down and came, and that's the kind of response that we try to build into what we're doing. Nick, as I said, is the client liaison. If there's anything day to day that I can't get Nick has the answer to it. Nick is here in Jacksonville. Our office is in River Place Tower right across the river. So he's local, as I said. The other folks at the table, I'm going to go through sort of why they're on the team and what we think the experience and point of having them involved is. On the left, we've got Pete Seckler. Pete runs our Community Solutions Group at GAI. Pete also, for the team, is focused on public realm infrastructure. So Pete has a long history in helping cities to create great public places. That experience ranges across the country. Some of it you see here in Jacksonville. He and our Community Solutions Group team designed River Place Boulevard, the hate to call it a road diet because it's way more than that, but the complete street that you see under construction there. He was a big part of the thought process through that. He's been on ULI tap panels here in Jacksonville, dealing with the connection to the north to UF Health. Years ago, he worked on a downtown open space framework, so he has a real depth of knowledge and leadership in that. To my left, Amira Saeed, we're looking to her to lead public involvement. Amira is local in Jacksonville. She's connected in the community. You may be familiar with her work through experience at FDOT over the past few years. So she is extremely connected in the community, and we think well adept at creating a public involvement program that you'll hear sort of sprinkled through some of the answers is one that drills deep and gets into communities early and tries to bring forward solutions that we think make the delivery of TOD projects something that can be the right answer when it comes to time for that project to happen. So Amira is an important part of the team. Moving over to Nick's right, this is Dr. Owen Beich. Owen is a planner. He's also a real estate expert, and he is leading all of our efforts at understanding and leveraging the market related to TOD. You will hear a lot from him today. One of the things that Owen, I think, really brings to bear is a depth of experience in Florida that I think is unrivaled relative to value capture to CRA and other TIF districts. And I think that is an important piece of how we make TOD happen in this city. To Owen's right is Troy Russ. So Troy and Pete and I all work together at a firm called Gladding Jackson. I'm the newbie of the group. I started there in 2000. And part of the thing that you'll hear Troy and I talk about is we cut our teeth learning how to do TOD and transit station area planning in Orlando and in Charlotte in the 2000s, and continued that practice in numerous other cities throughout the country and even some internationally. Troy now, after a stint as a planning director in a small town just outside of Denver, dealing with TOD on a policy and public sector level, is the practice director for the TOD group for Kimley Horn. And so as we think about folks who really understand ins and outs of how we make transit-oriented development happen, both from a transit agency perspective, a public agency perspective, and a developer perspective, Troy was the person that we knew we needed to call. Next to Troy, rounding out the team at the table, is Clarence Ng. Clarence is Kimley Horn's Florida TOD lead, and Clarence has a depth of experience dealing with policies related to transit and development in the state. One person that I want to mention that's absent from the table, we have, in addition to supporting folks from Eco Preserve on sustainability from Rhodes and Brito architects, Elizabeth Manley as a public realm landscape architect. One person who's not at the table, unfortunately, is Ashley Hand from CityFi. She is leading our smart mobility integration, she and Gabe Klein from their firm. Ashley had a baby probably a month or so ago, so she's not able to travel. She'll be back at work by the time that, that the project would start. So I wanted to make sure we didn't forget about them. Rounding out the team is really thinking about the public realm in that full perspective. So you've asked some questions. We're as we prepare, always trying to figure out, okay, what was the real question? We weren't in the room when you wrote the question. We weren't in your mind when you thought of the question. But we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the thing that they're trying to get to? And so, as we think about your second question related to the DIA board and the La Villa neighborhood development strategy, and the first project out of the gate with the townhome project that the city selected Vestcor to do, we think that's a really interesting place to start, because it talks about neighborhood development, it talks about connectivity to a transit infrastructure, and it also talks about how you create place and how you create a place that creates a culture of investment. And as we thought about that, Troy brought to mind some experience that started with work we did in Charlotte around the South Corridor light rail station at New Bern that I think is really instructive on that project relative to how places grow. So I'd like Troy to talk about that for just a second.
Yeah, so good afternoon. Blake and I had the good fortune of working in Charlotte for 10 plus years. And sort of from the very beginning, I was on the DEIS preliminary design team to lay out the stations for the Blue Line and the Blue Line extension to the north, but also develop a citywide transit-oriented development program. And we stayed with that program for 10 years. We're now, the Silver Line's going on board, and we're working with the airport right now on developing how they connect to the airport. But the New Bern story is really interesting, and I think it's relevant to Jacksonville in terms of the maturity of the TOD market. There's sort of a combination of folks as we implement TOD you have to sort of recognize. Obviously the property owner and the transit operator and JTA, but then the city and then the community. And oftentimes the city and the transit agency are on the same page in terms of density expectations, right? TOD, you're supposed to have higher density to produce ridership. But from a community perspective, they're not ready for that. They don't quite understand. And if you work on the public sector side, getting community buy-in is much more important from a council perspective and implementation perspective than I'll just say it because I'm one of them, a policy wonkhead thinking we should have the highest density possible. So New Bern's very interesting because New Bern was about a mile south of the preferred market in Charlotte. The preferred market in Charlotte was uptown and what they call South End. New Bern was about a mile south of that. And it was premature from a market perspective. So real quickly, I want you to see the diagram on the right. We created this diagram over the evolution of Charlotte, showing them the different stages of TOD. And you think of any sort of urban place, the market takes time to mature. And so at the beginning, when we were first putting in transit, even before the line was committed, we had development coming in that we had to manage. And this development request, the zoning code had minimums that weren't TOD oriented. And they were very disappointed with this density application. The zoning couldn't reinforce the density. And we were telling Charlotte, no, it's okay to have lower density development as long as the form is right. What we need to do is catalyze investment and create a culture of investment and sort of think of getting in really cold water. And you do it slowly, right? You don't do it quickly. And as you step into it, and because you have to bring all of your stakeholders along with you, right? The community. And so they want to see and feel what transit is like from a citizen perspective. The market, if we're beyond the market realities, creating that culture of investment is really important. So this is just a picture of that first investment that before the line was invested in. It was a 2-story townhome walk-up. The next slide is from 2007 to 2012, Once that investment was in, they started to achieve density belief in the private sector and acceptance from the community. That was the biggest one, that they could accept it. And then the next slide shows today. And we see a significant redevelopment of New Bern. This is maybe Charlotte's second best station from a TOD perspective outside of Uptown. And the interesting part, not only did we see strong investment, there was a strong line protecting the neighborhood that the investment never intruded upon for displacement. And really interestingly, the warehouse district highlighted in blue has been adaptive reuse. So we saw new investment that finally achieved TOD densities a solid 15 years after the investment. Widely accepted as one of the poster childs of investment. So as you think of the neighborhood being invested now in Jacksonville, you got to sort of think it's more than one property around transit, and you're creating a community. So Blake will go into detail about what we think the answer is you're looking for to your specific question.
Well, I think the question was, what are the effects of that within the city? So there are a couple of things that we would want to talk about. One of the effects of that lower density project at that location is that there, as Troy pointed out in the New Bern example, there is opportunity to ramp up density closer to the station. So there are 2 more blocks headed to the station. So it doesn't, as a location, preclude the right sort of density from happening near the station. That's an important thing to consider as number one. Number two is that in La Villa, one of the important things there, and I think it's important to think about throughout the rest of the downtown area, is how do you look at that neighborhood in context of the entire downtown? Because the neighborhood doesn't exist solely on its own. It exists in context. And if you look throughout the entire downtown, what you see is that there is what we in the plan talked about, a missing middle. You have Riverfront Tower sorts of development. You have Springfield neighborhood sorts of individual houses development. And you're starting to see some sort of apartment things, but really there's from single family homes up to apartments and then sort of walk-up style up to towers. There's a pretty big missing middle. And La Villa, we believed as a neighborhood development strategy, had the ability to meet some of that missing middle and to serve some of that missing middle. As we looked at the neighborhood, and this is where starting to understand and be able to reconcile concerns that JTA has about getting people to create ridership for the system, about being able to have the right form of development, together with community concerns about what the neighborhood grows to be like, together with other development concerns about what's viable. The most important thing in that location, we believe, and I think it's unique to this spot, is we needed to have a market rate for sale product. And that, we believe, together with the affordable product that you're seeing Vescor be able to produce in other locations, actually creates a much richer fabric of the neighborhood and actually leads to that culture of investment that we're trying to create. So I think that in lots of ways, even though it's a lower density maybe than we could have pushed for or maybe would have liked to have had happen, for many reasons, I think it's a very positive signal to the development community that this is a safe place to put your money. And that is one of the things we really believe is incumbent upon everyone involved in the mission to create that situation within the city. So one of the other questions you asked, and I think it's top of mind with everyone creating urban development, whether it's transit oriented or not, is what is what are parking needs? How do those relate to a place that can be served by transit? And then what are the implications of that on the real estate market? Because at the end of the day, parking impacts real estate more so than any other element of the urban environment. Owen has done a fair amount of research on that relationship and on the economics of delivering urban development related to parking. So I'd like him to be able to talk a bit about that question.
Thank you, Blake. Blake gave a very kind introduction. The one thing that he didn't mention that I think is relevant is that I'm a faculty member at the University of Central Florida Planning Program. And part of my mission there is to integrate planners into implementing what I call financially feasible and fiscally beneficial plans. So in effect, the market that Blake is talking about, the politics, the political savvy aspect is something that we try to sensitize the students to so that they make their fiscal and financial decisions and they can begin to understand the different dimensions of the constituencies that are affected by those decisions. We tend to see parking really as something we don't want in the main, and this is our future of the parking structure, is a lot of empty spaces. In reality, it's good to think of parking not just an abstraction, but as Blake says, as a building service. And as part of that building service, there are at least 4 different groups that are affected by this building service. And I want to talk about each of them for a little bit because I think you'll understand how we then approach kind of a parking management strategy. First is you have institutions and regulators, which I'm going to put you into that group. You have owners who are frequently going to be the developers that construct the buildings and then have to comply with whatever codes or standards, as well as the people that are investing in those buildings who have certain standards and certain criteria. And the standards for those investors in those banks is frequently different in the Southeast United States than it is, say, in New York City, where it wouldn't be at all unusual to construct a building that had no parking, with perhaps even in several blocks. Whereas in the Southeast United States, it's going to be an educational, transitional process as we expose these potential and prospective lenders to how we think about buildings with less, or in some cases, no parking. And then finally, we have the users, and they fall into 2 distinct groups in most cases. We either have residents who are coming to a job or who want to park at an apartment complex if that's their home. And then we have the employers who may or may not have flexibility. So the point is, in just a few minutes, we quickly see that there are many different perspectives and many dimensions on the notion of what parking really means beyond, just the spatial intrusion. In order to satisfy the real estate market, being mindful of the fact that most of the built environment is provided by private capital, we have to think about how those 4 different groups that are parties to these decisions work. And what that means is we're probably going to have some kind of a transitional strategy as we look at the world today and the world tomorrow. It forces us to think about at least these kinds of things. Do we want to create buildings where the parking that we would love to see disappear? Do we want to do our codes and our design requirements, want that parking to be integrated inside the structure so that we've elevated the cost, made it potentially adaptable, but potentially in the short term prohibitively expensive to then lease, develop, and implement? Do we want to think about how we better use surface situations? Do we want to encourage adjacent parking structures against buildings, which can be removed later in the same way a lot can be redeployed, because all of these have an economic and fiscal dimension? The bottom line is in this transitional stage, in order to keep all of these participants active and engaged in the marketplace, we have to be aware that it isn't a one-size-that-fits-all. And I think one of the things you're going to see through this discussion is the need to think about flexibility, not perhaps as a four-letter word, which it often is, but in a way of adapting to the systems that get you to the forms that you really want to be in a built-out condition.
So Owen, one of the things that we've talked about is experience between residential users and employers. Can you explain sort of the difference in the opportunities for a different set of parking needs and requirements for employers versus residents? Because I think that's important as we think about who the potential users of this might be and relative to the U2C system.
Yeah, well, occasionally your residents have great flexibility in terms of where they live and where they shop. They have choices available. An employer is generally going to be, at least in today's environment, and even this is transitioning, it's a fixed site. Or more people are working at home to take advantage of those multiple locational options. Despite a lot of social commentary to the contrary, we're not all migrating away from, urban workplaces, or what I would call, I guess, decentralized, because some of them are not necessarily urban. So employers have less flexibility, and it's those employers that are responsible for the bulk of commercial then development in commercial space. So we have to be particularly mindful of how parking then fits into their business model, both in the short term and the long term.
So to sort of tie a bow on it, Troy lives and works in Denver, obviously sees transit-oriented development happening in a more mature system. What are some of the things that you're seeing out there, and how does that relate to maybe some neighborhood adjacent conditions versus a downtown place? What are you seeing in the market?
Well, I think it comes back to my public sector experience and what is happening in Denver right now. Denver, in their urban neighborhoods that are richly served by transit, they have no parking, and you cannot put parking in, or they allow development to have zero parking. And the politics of parking is very different than the regulation of parking. And so the residents who live in the neighborhood had new investment come in, and they see these new investments come in without parking, they believe they're being negatively impacted by that, right? And they've actually put moratoriums on very good urban infill that had zero parking. And so while the planning wonkheads like me, that's why I'm bald, want zero parking, that's just me. Just me. I'm the wonkhead. But anyways, the politics of parking is very different than regulation. They reacted very negatively and got council to put a moratorium on very good infill development because the politics of parking. So again, getting into that cold water, being strategic and deliberate. Residents have more flexibility because they can choose how they move around. Employers have less flexibility because they want to recruit. So as the transit system matures, then employers get more flexibility on their parking standards. But the bottom line is working with the city of Jacksonville, having a robust outreach, and understand how parking plays in this. And being just smart about it. And oftentimes we try to get the plans to be idealistic versus realistic. And we want to, what Denver has seen is that knee-jerk reaction of political backlash, of planners asking too much. And just how do we be smart about it? So I would recommend you actually have minimum parking standards and put performance metrics in. So if the developer does things the right way, you can waive those parking requirements. And it's much more of using parking as a strategic tool to get what you want rather than give it away.
Yeah, let me just jump in on that. I think the strategic tool, that's a good takeaway from what I think we're trying to say with questions 1 and 2, which I think is that our answers are both about flexibility, being flexible in your thinking and flexible in how you're going to deploy strategic tools, with the goal being to get something good to happen. And different situational things near one station versus another, one street address versus another, can lead to different outcomes, and the goal is to get things moving. And I think that's really
That's
the
the bottom
underpinning.
line.
That's the bottom line of the success that we've had in Charlotte and other places.
And I think hopefully what you're starting to hear is that the fact that we have been a bad analogy, but in the trenches and through some of these discussions, even to almost outright fights in the past, has led us to some conclusions that we think are important. And it really is a very nuanced thing. It would be very simple to say, okay, you're served by transit, you have no parking requirement. I think we're here to kind of help you through that process and understand what goes along with those definitive statements that ultimately the public has to make. The fourth question you asked about what do we believe the positive or negative business impacts will be on growth and the planning of TOD around U2C stations. As we think about business impacts, we think really about return on investment to folks who are making that investment. And that's really twofold. It's return on investment to the community and individuals in the business community and the neighborhoods who are making investments in those places. And so how do you facilitate that through your actions and through the actions of the other actors who bring this to bear? And we think it's return on investment to JTA and to the broader public purse. How do we capture that value? So I want Clarence to be able to talk about the former, about ways that things work with the community, and then Owen to be able to talk about value capture and that impact to JTA and the broader public organization. So Clarence first, probably.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, this is an exciting time. I mean, transit-oriented development, is something that is, I would say unique, but it's a little bit new for Florida. Before Florida, I spent a lot of time in the DC-Baltimore area doing transit and transit-oriented development, right? And transformational development takes effort. Change is hard. People they're used to their environment, and you're asking them to do something different, right? And so for me, so I lead the transit TOD practice in Florida. Prior to Kimley Horn, I actually was a principal at Renaissance Planning, and back about 10 years ago, actually developed some of the place types and TOD framework for JTA. And also more recently, I just reviewed the TCAR for the U2C. So I'm really familiar with Jacksonville, and I think what I want to sort of bring into this conversation, having said that change is difficult, is at the end of the day, the businesses, the community is invested, right? They're here, right? So one of the common goals that we all have is to make sure that we're helping build upon that, strengthen the economy, right? Allow them to do what they do best. But when any capital project happens, whether it be a streetscape, whether it be, development in larger scale, there are impacts to the existing businesses. So we, as a team, have a lot of experience. And I'll talk about one, just to sort of reference one, because I think it's important. Kimley Horn was part of the Central Avenue BRT, the BRT, as well as the light rail in Minneapolis. The lessons that were learned there were actually helping FTA define some guidance on how to move forward. Because any major project such as that had impacts in the short term and sort of longer term, but there were lessons learned and tools that were applied that allowed them to really, if you look at the numbers, the businesses actually grew 4 times, as much investment in the future. But I'm not going to dispel that there were impacts, right? And so how did we, again, dealing with that part of the economy, small businesses, you need a variety of sort of financial tools to allow them to bridge that gap. It includes loans, some repayable loans, some forgivable loans, right, as well as grants. Because they're small businesses, they don't think about having to, they built their business, the four walls, and they're trying to deliver a service or a good. They're not thinking, they're not wired to say, well, what does that impact and how do I move through it? So allowing them to have access to those funds, does that mean some relocation, temporary relocation, so that their leases, they're able to cover their cash flow? So that's really important. So some of those financial assistance are important. Communication, being able to know well in advance, these are the things that are going to happen, right? So they can plan for it. Again, they're small businesses, they don't always plan long term, but being able to give them advance notice. And then as an agency, but also working with private entities as well as nonprofits, being able to partner with them, giving them the additional tools. It could be marketing, some legal, bookkeeping. Those are the things that again, real tangible assistance. Because as you all know, in terms of capital projects, timelines are a little bit unpredictable. Sometimes things take a little longer. So being able to be flexible, allowing them, be able to communicate with them, I think is really important. And really and so as an agency, sort of thinking of your all's role as JTA, working with the city, development authority, being able to partner, understand where those gaps are really important. Because at the end of the day, their future and their future success is really tied to this, right? So what we really want is to be able to maintain their success along the corridor and for them to stay. Yes, at times there will be change because some of them might be, through the opportunity, maybe they'll grow, maybe they'll relocate. But that's something that, as part of the overall process, is really important. A couple other things is that, again, if you think about that being today, and sort of the context of a future tomorrow, is that really what we're planning for is a vibrant transit-oriented development future, right? And what does that mean? It's that we're now starting to take the richness of what's there today, be able to transform, add additional density, add additional uses, add additional people that create this destination where it's a place where you want to go, right? So there'll be more business opportunity for them, and for them to be able to, again, think beyond the impact of today is going to be important. So incentives, being able to, again, tap into the richness of the different neighborhoods, because each of these neighborhoods will be a little bit different, right? And the context is going to be very different. So that's something that we have to be cognizant of. I think that emphasizing the additional mobility connections and their opportunities and that richness, I think, is important. Because if we think about the context, and as what was described of the affordability, that's an opportunity here. Because we can provide options for affordable housing. It's access to jobs, right, from those who are there. Additional affordable housing opportunities, being able to help preserve the housing and be able to even incentivize and help stabilize neighborhoods, but also really be able to improve the overall quality of life. And I think that is sort of I'm trying to make sure that we have one foot in the present, but also thinking about the future. And what ties us all together is communication.
So Clarence has a huge amount of passion for how we do this. I think that comes through in everything that we're thinking about building that value for the community. When we're successful in delivering TOD and effectuating that, that's going to create an immense amount of value for the city and for the agency. And I want Owen to talk about some of the ways that value can be captured, because at the end of the day, that's the thing that we're headed toward, is how do we create the value, and then how do we get that value to be put back into the community to create a virtuous cycle of of development. So Owen?
Yeah, I'm mindful that one of your missions is to maintain a sustainable program, and you have a sustainability officer and responsible person for dealing with that. When we talk about that three-legged stool, the one that I find that's often a little shorter than the other is the idea of economic sustainability. We have a good feel for the other dimensions. But for you as an agency, you need a sustainable or desire a sustainable income stream, one that you can manage perhaps even more aggressively or proactively than maybe just ridership. Ridership is never going to cover the entire fare box or anything, or if you do, then you need to sell your services to us, and we'll work with that. That will be a sustainable revenue stream for you, is sharing that knowledge with others. But you're going to do this in part by unlocking value in sites you either control or sites that you exercise a great deal of authority over. You're going to do that through public-private situations. In some cases, you may simply sell a site, you may lease a site, you may develop it jointly. But the idea is to take not just buildings, a building, but multiple buildings, perhaps multiple sites, and make strategic decisions among those in a coordinated program so that you can combine them and leverage them. And leverage is the word I like the most, because that's how we shorten up that other leg of the stool. It's a little bit rockier, like sticking those matchbook covers under that third leg. The idea of value recapture, at least in Florida, has made great strides. We can do way more in this state under our legal authority than we can in other states where certain things and their interaction with the private side are relatively restricted. And we have a great deal, if you have strong interest in bringing publicly owned resources or assets to private investment, we have a lot of flexibility here that in other states are in fact prohibited. So we can encourage investment proactively. We can respond to opportunities that are brought to us, and we can do that legally. But the idea is to think about strategically inventorying those opportunities that we have as part of a larger program, and then sequencing them to make them work for you financially.
So one of the jobs of project manager is managing a three-ring circus, and if that means telling your boss he needs to go plug in the computer while the rest of us talk, then that's because you forgot to do it yourself. Then that's part of
what they're good for.
Of the job. So I think talking about the positives of the value that can be created, the way that we capture that value. Those are all sort of bright, shiny things. There are some things that are sort of more contentious, maybe. And certainly traffic is one of the things that, in sort of traditional cities, folks love transit for the other guy because it keeps them off the street, right? And I think our perspective about traffic really gets to the notion of partnerships. So partnerships in all the folks who have ownership and a stake in the street, in the public realm, which there's folks who own it, folks who run it, folks who operate in it, folks who use it, folks who feel comfortable in it, folks who feel a little ill at ease in it. So understanding those partnerships, understanding the way that things can and maybe possibly can't change is important. And then being able to effectuate that change through a different context. So I think we've got a couple of folks on the team who can really drill into that. So maybe Troy, if you talk about kind of the first idea about sort of today versus tomorrow, and maybe Amira has some examples that you can draw from that are instructive for the folks here.
So just real quickly, traffic is in the eye of the beholder. As Blake said, there's a lot of different interests in the road, and if we want TOD, we need a decent road that the building is being invited to the street to front, right? But we have others that have operational demands that they pick up the phone call. If I'm a council member or an engineer, they get complaints because of potholes or congestion. And just sort of knowing the two extremes is really, really important. And I had the good pleasure of meeting Blake in 2000 when I was lucky enough to be a part of the team to take the freeway out of downtown Chattanooga. And that's hard to do. Taking a freeway out of a riverfront. Fortunately, we had an aquarium there that we had good cause. It was right on the Tennessee River. But we took that freeway out. And to do that, you have to understand, first and foremost, it wasn't a planner's idea imposed on the Tennessee Department of Transportation. That's not how it happens. It's really about outreach and coordinating with Amira and the stakeholders in the corridor and understand that what you want implemented, those individuals that are responsible for implementing it need to be at the table. And they need to be a part of the team, understand the solution, and implement it, right? Today, lots of the areas around JTA stations, I would argue this diagram is what we have in front of us, right? Move cars as if nothing else matters, right? And there's only two ways to do that. You do that through more pavement, either wider or broader streets or more street network, or more efficiency, roundabouts, one-way streets, traffic signal timing. That's really the one you do it, because that's the context that FDOT or maybe the Public Works Department at the city, that's the context they're operating in. The political realities of the streets out there today, they pick up the phone calls, you don't, on dealing with potholes and congestion. And if there's not a compelling reason to change that environment, it's going to be really hard to convince them to do so. And the next slide sort of shows you tomorrow, right? There's a vision of what TOD is, right? We're moving people, not just cars. We're doing that hopefully through JTA. We're doing it through walking and biking and micromobility and the shared economy and everything that comes with it, with the shared economy. We're improving the quality of the trip through streetscapes for the pedestrians, improving the comfort, safety, and experience, protected bike lanes, elevating the role of alternative modes so they can circulate. We're traffic calming. We're elevating personal security. We're designing for women and actually thinking about that at the start. Putting lighting out, thinking of more than the white male that walks at 22 years old that we have designed our cities for before. We need to think contextually to everyone who uses the system. We need to move less people, fewer miles. That is what TOD is, right? It's density and mixtures of uses. So I don't have to drive somewhere, I can walk. And if we can shorten the trip by land use, that's the most effective way of creating a transit environment. That is tomorrow. You don't have that today. And so implementing that over tomorrow, who do we have to have at the table today to have that conversation? And really bringing those stakeholders in, because you will be able to implement your ideas for tomorrow if they're at the table today. And I think Amira can give some examples of that.
Yeah, thank you. I guess drawing from experiences, I've worked with and for FDOT, and then also for a year consulted with Brightline. So drawing from those experiences, I can tell you that what's being said is essentially that you need to first know who your stakeholders are and your partnerships. And I'll give you a good example is I worked very closely with the expansion for the MD Anderson. And with that, part of the issue was they were coordinating with the city of Jacksonville. However, the biggest player was not seen, which was FDOT, because the ramp distance for that was an issue. So coming in to see the negative side of not coordinating well in advance, it's very important that you identify who the stakeholder is and then putting it into context, like what was being said just now. It's very important because the needs for MD Anderson are different from the needs for FDOT and the city of Jacksonville. Some of the roads might be one-way streets. The issue might have been not just alleviating traffic, but it was the traffic circulation. It was the signal timing. So using those kind of examples is first identify who's the stakeholder and where are they trying to go. And it's not just about just alleviating traffic and getting people off of I-95. It's really looking at the location, identifying who the stakeholders are, and then coming to a tangible solution. And what did that tangible solution do? It was cost effective. it streamlined the whole process, because something that would have been accomplished over a whole year, because we brought everybody to the table, asked them, what is your issue, and then problem solving it incrementally. We actually did a project that probably could have taken a year within 3-4 months, and signal timing was changed, lane changes were accommodated, striping was redone, and the biggest thing was accounting for the new influx of employees and their parking demand. So the walkability factor, even with the parking garage, was an issue. So even DOT was like, is that a sustainable way of addressing the employees' needs? Then there was issue of walkability, connecting, and things like that. So just echoing what everybody else is saying is you have to have a holistic approach, but at the same time, you have to be flexible and willing to talk to the right folks at the onset, so that you are getting something that can be implemented in a shorter time frame. Too many times we do studies, we do analysis, and shelve it because we just haven't gone and approached it in a fashion that requires, basically implementation. So, I mean, I'm just drawing from one of those examples, also being involved in the mobility around the JRTC is also something that, had to be coordinated, and it, again, looked at all of the topics we're talking about, land use to parking, to signal timing, to is it alleviating traffic or adding traffic upstream, downstream, and coordinating with not just FDOT, but also looking at environmental impacts if you had to involve FHWA. So there's a myriad of things, but it's important to understand that the first thing is identify who are those folks, and then putting it all in context.
Yeah, so
You're itching to answer.
Yeah, well, a magic word occurred to me on questions 2 and 3 when we're dealing with physical form, development form, parking form, and that had to do with sort of targeted flexibility to help get things to happen. I think, thinking about questions 4 and 5, which is really about business effects and traffic effects, I think the word that we are sort of getting at is, I would say, you could say stewardship. I think that the approach that we have is that we think of ourselves as stewards of the urban environment. We think of ourselves as stewards of the players that are involved, and stewards of the places that we're trying to work with those players to create. And so I think stewardship of the process and stewardship of the economic outcomes for both JTA and the business community at every step, whether those are small fine-grained policy things or construction manager liaison type people that might be happening when the sidewalk is getting poured in front of your business, or bigger picture ideas about stewardship. If you think about long-term, economic sustainability within the marketplace, what are we building and will it survive? And how does it relate to ridership over a period of time? Those are things that we take very personally, and we think of ourselves as stewards as we look at these types of areas.
So to sort of put a bow on the traffic issue, and maybe actually to complicate it a little bit, one of the discussions that I have had several times as we've been thinking about how to do this with Ashley and Gabe from CityFi is the fact that we are, as Troy has sort of pointed out, we have a context today about how traffic moves. We have a context tomorrow about how traffic moves. But 20 years ago when Troy and I started working in Charlotte, if we had said, hey, what you could do is you could go to the corner and get a scooter and ride the scooter 3 blocks and then drop the scooter off, people would have looked at you like you were crazy, all right? But technology has allowed things to change so quickly that the way we use the public realm, the way we use our streets has changed in a corresponding manner. And so in the reason that we wanted to include Ashley and Gabe on the team is their perspective of how we manage change for a transportation paradigm that we may not even be able to anticipate yet. So when your vehicles are autonomous when cars are autonomous, not if, but when that happens. How does that space within the street get managed? How do all the users of the space get addressed? What are the things we have to potentially solve for? And what are the possibilities that that opens up? If, for instance, one of the things we've talked about is if a transit system can get to people in a much more deeper and direct way, maybe the old notion of a point-based TOD system evolves into a district-wide TOD opportunity. So I think those sorts of things reinforce the way that we might think about how we solve the problem. And I think this is a situation where we really have to start to define the problem before we come up with ways to address it. In terms of opportunity, you have asked us about our thoughts on First Baptist Church and their announcement that they would consolidate operations to a block and sell the other blocks. In short, I think the answer to the direct answer to the question of how do we think a downtown TOD strategy is impacted by that move, the short answer is, well, it takes 9 blocks that would not have been part of a strategy, that would have been otherwise locked up in a use that is, from a development perspective, fairly static and fairly dark, and actually bring those onto the market and actually be able to be part of a strategy and be able to, instead of a gulf, be sort of a connective tissue through that part of downtown from Hemming Plaza north to Rosa Parks. Because it's at its heart a real estate issue, I always lean on Owen for answers to real estate questions. And he's usually good enough to not say location, 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 but to actually give some deeper thought into the implications of what these blocks being on the market actually means to both the market downtown, maybe some of the proximate developments, and a TOD strategy.
This is one of those questions when Blake was talking before. I mean, is there a subtext to the question? I mean, in a sense, there's just one answer, and it's 2 words: great opportunity. I can't recall in my professional career in Florida, for that matter several other states, where that many blocks in a dense urban core have become available under unified ownership. It's possible to assemble 9 blocks from one small user, several small users, but to have a single entity in potentially a game-changing location is truly extraordinary. We had occasion to prepare this for JAX USA, and this was prepared as a way of identifying in the larger Jacksonville area your opportunity zone priorities and how different combinations of activities within each zone can be worked together in order to leverage any one of them. It's kind of well, it is called a prospectus, which is by definition to be an informative document for potential investors. So when I mentioned before, how do we become sustainable? You know, we become sustainable by identifying these kinds of opportunities that we may want to work with and pursue. In this particular setting, not only do we have a game-changing assemblage, it could actually be for new development. Interestingly enough, it could be redevelopment. If only the parking is retained, it potentially becomes a centerpiece for a massively rethought, perhaps interim parking strategy that's part of a larger parking management scheme. And we're located roughly between 2 stations so that we have the opportunity to pursue both commercial development. We have the opportunity to pursue greatly intensified residential development. We have an opportunity to do this in partnership. We have the opportunity to do this through encouragement. in partnership or encouragement, because it's a church. There's potentially a great sensitivity for more affordable housing product. Certainly something that fills a missing place inside the strata of development options that might be available. I see this as something perhaps comparable to the hospital district that we're involved in South Orlando, where 300 acres or so associated with the hospital is under massive redevelopment, leading to a combined and partnered neighborhood strategy that doesn't altogether center on transit, but transit is one of the centerpieces of this larger 300-acre initiative. Frankly, in my mind, this is one of the more exciting and easier questions to answer, because I think the only thing that you could do wrong here would be to ignore the opportunity. I think the options are myriad, whether you participate directly or just encourage.
Can I add? You may. Yes.
There's sort of two examples. A question back to JTA. I had the good fortune of leading the Orlando Venues Master Plan. And so when the Orlando Magic Arena moved over to Church Street from the Centroplex, we had leftover land we had to strategize for and find partnerships, right? So what sort of community void do you need filled, right? We had UCF and the interactive environment, that they're just now EA Sports is moving in, and others sort of big announcements. So these opportunities are rare, but it's a question back to the city of Jacksonville, the church, and JTN, what role do you want to play? Westminster Mall. I had nothing to do with Westminster Mall, but Westminster Mall is in the Denver metro area. The city of Westminster, it's like all malls, it died. But it was the center and core of this suburban community. And so traditional economic development strategies are, if the market is strong, put the zoning in, place the proper infrastructure, back up and let the market do its thing, right? But it varies from strong to weak. And there's different roles everyone can play in this. And so Orlando it took time, but they had a stronger market. Westminster was dead in a weak market. So the city actually became the proactive developer. They bought the mall, and they're individually developing the parcel. They didn't do a partnership with the development investors. And so there's a full spectrum of the city or JTA and the church working collaboratively to develop the property on their own, to just standing back and letting the magic work. But I think the deliberate nature of how you understand the site through sound economics, understanding the partners, you can lay out a strategy that works with the transit expectations. And as Owen said, it's just a great opportunity. But I wanted to give you perspective. I think this is an opportunity to really help the church think through. One of the things we did in Charlotte, they added a development response team to the scope that we actually, as development opportunities came on, the planning department deliberately had us sort of sidetrack and focus on a specific opportunity. And we worked with the development up and down all the transit lines in Charlotte to proactively do that. Is that an opportunity here to sidetrack and work with the church? So just something to think about.
I would add to that, if I might, just very quickly. What we're talking about is taking advantage of an opportunity as well as managing expectations. In that regard, while I don't even want to equivocate anything I've said, one thing this team has is vast redevelopment experience. And so maybe the notion of it being centered exclusively on transit, it perhaps undersells the experience. Most of the people at this table were extensively involved in what really comprises the state of Florida's largest redevelopment ever, which would be the redevelopment of the Orlando Naval Training Center. So we're talking about 1,000 acres of totally repurposed, redeployed property, of which the city, as stewards, took a lead role in deciding how this property should be developed. And several of the people here took lead roles in advising the city on the concept, soliciting the developers, guiding the developers, assuaging the developers through the difficult process of ultimate acquisition and then environmental remediation. And today, Baldwin Park stands as a seamless portion of the city of Orlando, linking the city of Winter Park and the city of Orlando and many, many other services. I mean, it's because of its extraordinary location, stands as a testimony to how you can guide something that is so underutilized and so redirected in terms of form and function that you can create extraordinary value. This has repaid back the city of Orlando literally thousands, maybe millions of times in terms of tax dollars, exposure, form, lessons learned. I mean, it's an amazing place.
So when you say the people at this table have done some things. But actually, Owen has probably financially articulated and authored, more redevelopment, real estate redevelopment packages, with multi-party, in these types of environments as anybody that I can think of, certainly in the state of Florida. And I think there's multiple ways that this property could shake out, and I think that our team generally, and Owen specifically, can be of material help to gen up, some conversation about different economic development outcomes for that property that can be beneficial to the church, beneficial to the city, beneficial to the JTA's mission of ridership and good urban form. And we are excited about unpacking that question when we hopefully can be selected on this project if we're so fortunate.
All right, so it looks like we're about an hour into things. The last thing that I think you asked us to talk about was a presentation of a previous TOD project. So we'll try to get through this, and then hopefully you guys have lots of questions we'd love to answer. I wish I had worked on Baldwin Park. I only lived there, so I can attest to the good job that you did, Owen. As we sort of racked our brains thinking about which TOD project we wanted to talk about, we wanted to make it about something that's relevant to JTA and to the situation that you're facing in Jacksonville. So we quickly threw out like the BCT joint development feasibility study that I did down in Fort Lauderdale, where it was just about one block and how do you redevelop the transit terminal and do joint development on top of that I think now Broward County is looking at as a site to grow onto. A single block, we said, okay, maybe that's what's going on in Jacksonville is bigger than that. A TOD plan in Abu Dhabi that I got sent to on Troy's recommendation. Thanks.
I know I know.
Way too hot, way different environment, but extensive, right? So we're trying to find this kind of Goldilocks project. Do we talk about Troy's work in the Pearl District in Portland? Do we talk about Owen's work with All Aboard Florida? Probably not, although they lend to that great experience that we have. We've learned something from every one of those projects. The thing that we wanted to get to was something that was a corridor-wide planning. It was beyond just a singular building or a singular project. It needed to have multiple stations. It had to have varied market conditions among those stations, and it had to talk about changing policies, improving the public realm, and creating supportive infrastructure for development. So we actually ended on, we're going to talk about the TOD facilitation program that we did for Sunrail, and that went from as Sunrail was going under construction to when it was starting to be in operation. But the story doesn't actually start there. This is like Paul Harvey, the rest of the story thing. It doesn't actually start there. That story starts 20 years ago in Charlotte with the place that we cut our teeth on that work.
I'll actually go 5 years before that. It actually starts in downtown Orlando, when Orlando was doing the light rail system that Orange County voted at the last minute to kill. And the federal funding grant agreement, the full funding grant agreement that the FTA had approved prior to a local match was stalled for a year. $300 million in federal money was stalled for a year. The city of Charlotte took advantage of it. And I think what Blake and Pete and the rest of this team is, we are students of TOD. And this story begins in Orlando as we began studying that area. It went on to Charlotte because we were fortunate enough to go into Charlotte. And it continues into Sunrail that Blake will tell those stories. And it's going to go into the future because we're going to learn so much just from talking to you and understanding your market and your market dynamics. It's going to continue to evolve. But there were some key expectations that when I first started this, was I'm a planner, I'm a wonk-head, I want to make sure I get the highest density and the most walkable environment around transit. What we learned through this process is the TOD market, and namely, it evolves as the market matures, right? It is fundamentally tied to the market. So not all stations are created equal. That's the bottom line. Some stations are hot, some are not, and they will take time to get going. But TOD evolves as the market matures. Importantly from that, it sort of continues on, political support evolves as TOD matures. So in Charlotte, when we did our first work, we couldn't do mandatory rezoning. It was all voluntary. I couldn't kick out a Butler building warehouse for employees. We couldn't do any rezoning. It was all voluntary. And because the politics weren't quite understanding it, you have to see it on the ground in the community you're working in to realize TOD. So as these examples of TOD started going, you start to get political support. And you get political support. So now Charlotte revamped our zoning ordinance, and now it's mandatory. They are doing mandatory rezoning, and they are going up and down, and they're much more aggressive because the market is there, and more importantly, the politics are there. But then as the politics mature, right, then the technical partnerships and allowances of TOD to realize TOD matures. It matures as politics mature. In other words, our parking ratios suddenly go away once the politics have matured. Our coordination with FDOT and their acceptance for innovative roadway design will mature as the politics mature, because they can't afford to widen roads in rich urban TOD places. So they're going to have to find a solution. So understanding that dynamic from TOD, from the market, politics from the TOD, and then all the allowances to truly create a rich TOD environment will come from the political support. And then lastly,
Please insert parking as an example.
well, parking is a great example of that. In terms of once you're there, the market has the politics are much more willing to waive parking standards or create, maximums to maximize that. That's all a political question. But lastly is, we're not perfectionists, right? Back in Charlotte in 2000, even Orlando, affordable housing was not an issue. Social equity was not an issue. In terms of a lot of the displacement that has occurred from TOD, it wasn't in the forefront of our minds in the early 2000s, late 1990s, right? Because Charlotte's investment, it wasn't an issue. Affordability and displacement were not an issue. So we focused on first and last mile and zoning. But we implemented everything that came out of it because those people were at the table. Our partners were at the table. Now we know economic mobility, social equity, affordable housing are all critical components of that. And so they have to be at the table today. And if they're at the table today, we can implement it. So that's sort of lessons learned that I think are now going to evolve into Sunrail.
Right. So with Sunrail, the task was based on that knowledge that we had about what works, maybe what doesn't work, and what some of the blind spots were. We had really three main things that we did. So the first was about technical outreach and education. So how do we take the things that we know are good for TOD and communicate those to staff level folks, to elected official folks, and to the market in general, the people who are day-to-day involved in delivering buildings and environment to the market. So that's technical outreach and education. That's an important part. The next was, how do we track how well we're doing? So are there metrics that we can start from the beginning, from well before the system happens, and say, what was this place like at that point? What's it like now and where is it planned to be in the future. So those metrics deal with community level things like connectivity. They deal with things like the number of businesses within a 5-minute walk of the station. So we did those metrics, and part of the metrics played back to the outreach was, how do we explain how well we're doing to the elected officials so that they can start to let everybody know that TOD is actually a viable thing in the market. And the third piece was understanding that outreach, and then understanding the metrics and how we're doing and where we've identified that we may need to augment things in certain places. How can we do implementation and action plans at specific locations to make those metrics better for development? So when we did that, there's a few things that I think are really important to what you're doing here in Jacksonville. One is that we had to engage both the decision makers and the stakeholders in parallel. So not one and then the other, but actually all together. We had to develop this strategy for how we get a culture of investment. As we've talked about today, we had to understand joint development opportunities and how those play back into the system. And then we realized we had to give a lot of support to the early adopters and the major users, as creating that identity that TOD is actually a thing, and that, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to live next to a station. Maybe I don't need 2 cars, maybe I can get by with one. If I've got one, maybe I can get by with the train and a bike. So as we did that, talking about engaging decision makers and stakeholders in parallel, one of the big outreach points was actually to businesses. So we did a whole series of things like this where we said, look, if you're at the Orlando Health Station, so one of the 2 large hospitals in the city, there are at that station about 9,400 jobs, but within a 20-minute ride of that station, there are 98,000. And so the viability of that location in the market, when you talk about how connected it is to the labor force, becomes a differentiator that prior to the system being online did not exist. And so getting that idea across was hugely important. Talking about how we tracked TOD, how we let elected officials particularly understand and be able to be armed with the knowledge. At one point we had $700 million or so of things under construction. We also had another $900 million of other projects that had been announced or were pending some sort of approval process. And so a big part of our facilitation was to say, okay, what do we need to do to turn that dashed $900 million arrow into a green $1.6 billion arrow? How can we facilitate through infrastructure investments, through something as simple as, maybe we need access improvements for certain locations. So that was a big point of it. We worked on just visualizing for the community. What would TOD look like, across from the Sand Lake Road station? What are the things that are important to have in the environment? What are the benefits of this, to build that community story as we went along? That strategy to create that culture of investment, we had to tell the story over and over and over and prove to folks in the market and who have a say over the market that there's public investment in the station plus public investment in infrastructure. That's going to drive private development nearby. We showed examples of where that happened, not transit related in the community, and streetscapes and Main Street investments, to build the idea and understanding that this is a time-tested way of developing. Because one of the things with a new technology, and TOD is a new thing, is it's scary to be the first one to adopt it. So we had to do everything we could to help Central Station, get on the ground, to help the Ivy and Craig Usler's project here at the other hospital in town, to add housing that could be geared toward nurses and other healthcare workers in their market who could live there, walk to work, and maybe they don't need a car because they're next to the station and they can get anywhere else on the system. We took those metrics, we made sure that everyone knew the benefits of the station. This is sort of a beta version of the prospectus, but related to the station. We got that on the website. We worked with the realtors and the brokers to really build up this notion of that TOD is a viable activity around these stations. We looked at joint development. So beyond just a parking lot adjacent to a station and beyond just, okay, what does it look like? This was in Longwood where folks said, you know, we really need to develop that parking lot that we have. That needs to be a joint development site. We worked with the city, worked with the local agencies to figure out a whole series of different programs to test of understanding what the market would bear, understanding rents, understanding scale and density, and run pro forma analysis to figure out what the return on investment would be. And in this particular case, it was very eye-opening because the decision was we could make a small investment, we could have a small ROI on a small project, or we could have a really low ROI on a really big project. Maybe the market is not there yet and we need to hold this, you know, so it's not a buy, it's not a sell, it's kind of a buy and hold. So we did that level of detail for the system. And then I think this is really important, and particularly here in Jacksonville, talking about what do we do to support the early adopters and the major users. You have built-in constituencies in potential to serve here. You've got 2 hospitals. We have 2 hospitals in Orlando, Adventist to the north, Orlando Regional Medical Center in the south. We worked extensively with both of them. We worked with folks even to relocate business near TOD. So not necessarily what is built, but also how do we fill the stuff that is built. Those are all important things in improving the viability of the station. I wanted to show this because I think it's hugely important in working with those major users. So the venues in the arena downtown to the 2 hospitals, totally analogous to the stadium district and UF Health and Baptist MD on that end. We were working at the transit level. Pete was working with the hospital system to sort of reform their form of their campus and get development to the station and make that something that was viable for use by the healthcare professionals. Owen worked with Adventist at the same time to figure out a way to subsidize rides for their employees. So it becomes about how do we make an effective integrated system that development truly is transit oriented rather than really nice development that happens to be adjacent to transit. So we have talked for a long time. You have been
About 90 minutes.
You've been exceedingly patient, and I think that we would love to hear any questions or thoughts that you might have.
Common theme throughout all of it is, stakeholder engagement, community engagement. So like what kind of tools or strategies do you have centered around kind of engaging that kind of parallel engagement of both of those at the same time and either technological or traditional?
So I'll let Amira answer that question. I think that the short answer would be it's a layered approach. But I think she has a good handle on what some of those layers might be.
I think it's absolutely correct that you have to use all the tools you have, and the biggest thing is knowing who the players are through experience, being local and having worked with all the agencies, and then knowing the type of communities where those TOD stations are going to be very critical. There are some very engaged communities and there are some not so engaged communities. So being versatile and flexible in that area, but it's always important that things get flushed with the stakeholders, and then you kind of move into the community engagement side of it, because it's always not necessarily a parallel effort for some of these TOD stations, but it could be a staggered, layered approach as well. Some of the tools are obviously using the traditional methods just based on local experience, but using technology is extremely important. I mean, everybody now, in most of the locations that you have your TOD stations, you've got hotspots where, online surveys can be taken. Most people have access to the web to take surveys and things like that to engage. And then there's also, news channels and things like that that are very good. I mean, engaging things like, the NPR, having some of your audiences engage with the media as well is a good deployment. But at the same time, it's always healthy to have a transparent process through the whole thing. And the transparency comes with engaging your stakeholders, your political elected officials.
Right, so most rapidly adopted technology in human history, right? Everybody has one. This completely changes the way that you work at a grassroots and grass tops level. I think, Pete, can you talk about the grassroots and grass tops and sort of how we reach into the community and the sort of multiple ways we might do that?
Sure. So we're working right now with the Port Authority of Allegheny County, which is essentially the Pittsburgh Transit Agency, on an assignment of station area planning, and you're in a wide variety of sort of contexts there, because you may be in a disinvested neighborhood, you may be in an emergent neighborhood, you may be BRT technology versus LRT technology, you may be downtown, you may be in the Bakery District where Google is. So you're dealing with lots of different kinds of folks, and I think when we talk to local businesses or residents that are in an area, yes, we use different technologies. We do things that are online, we do things with websites, we do in-person meetings, at community centers and things like that. I think that the discussion is about understanding the values that people really have about their community and what their aspirations are, and establishing an open and transparent dialogue about the upward mobility of the area and opportunities for them where they live or where they conduct business. At the grass tops level, it's really about articulation not only of what the design vision is, but it's articulating the development opportunity. And so the probably the altitude of conversation probably changes a little bit. And I think that, again, those are face-to-face meetings, but there are also things where, again, we need to be able to articulate things to folks in the language that they understand, or the things that matter to them. And I think that we're pretty fluid in being able to work with a very wide degree of stakeholders, and both listen to them and try to hear them in their language, but then speak back to them both graphically, verbally, and numerically in their language.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Got about 3 questions. First one, Laura. I think we can all agree at some level FDOT is probably one of the most archaic institutions. So being able to unlock potential in some of the, if you look at the spine of the various different stops that are proposed by JTA, Riverside, State Union, Forsyth, those all play a huge role in the ability for what you're proposing or anyone else may very well propose to come to fruition. And FDOT is a key role in whether or not the development can really meet its full potential, or some potential, or not at all. from a medical aspect with MD Anderson, they had to cave. Not necessarily saying that they have to cave in terms of the aspiration and wish of what you'd like to see from a growth aspect for JTA from a development standpoint. How would you bring you in an engagement aspect, say that we bring FDOT into the light?
There is a culture at FDOT which is very much vehicular based. Everything has to be auto-centric, and the results and the metrics have to be auto-centric. So part of the issue is appealing to the correct folks within the hierarchy of DOT, because it is very protocol oriented, to approach them in a fashion that they understand. So for example, like MD Anderson, yes, they caved in because it was the political clout that was given over, okay, I want my sign at Baptist to be right there on the ramp. I don't care whether it's backing up or not. And then trying to explain to FDOT from a technical perspective the benefit that it gives them, because sometimes an expansion can negatively impact them where it costs them long term because they now know it's a deficient roadway. I've got to expand the roadway, or I've got to, during a 3R project on resurfacing, they have to then coordinate internally saying, okay, the solution isn't roadway expansion, the solution is accommodating for bicycle pedestrian, just striping. So it's really presenting to DOT, who's probably got, what, 75% of ownership of the roads in City of Jacksonville, to know the context. Sometimes it can be economic development, the way you present it to them, but it is really speaking their language, and that's kind of where it goes. Speaking their language and then speaking to the right folks. If there is a traffic issue, you don't go to the work program person that heads up the work program. That's just the funding area. Typically it does. It goes to the director level. Well, the director doesn't know anything about it. You have to go to the right folks to solve that problem. And I think seeing it from a DOT perspective, if there was a development issue, the agencies would never come to me, which is where I was dealing with it. I always noticed that they'd go at the higher level and then it would trickle down. You're just wasting time that way. It's like, go to the source, the people that know it, and then sit down and give the context. Get them out of thinking the culture of automobiles and metrics for automobiles. Hats off to DOT is now they are beginning to think complete streets, context sensitive. And so now that they have begun to understand that, I feel that there is a lot more headway being made in collaboration and getting things on the ground to support TOD in particular. Because there was always this nervousness is, if there are no automobiles and you're relieving congestion, well, what am I doing sitting here? It's a job security as well, I think you have to always remember, is now that they are accountable for mobility and not just traffic as we traditionally see it with cars. I think they are feeling accountable for it as well.
So you said you had three.
Just on the DOT, I think it is talking to the right people, but being empathetic to their purpose. And so, yes, you don't want to just invite the people who can only say no to a meeting. Not a good strategy, right? You want the people who can say yes. And so we actually intervened and have mayor to mayor, director to director, invite them to be a part of a process. But at the same time, if you're just asking for them to give to the project's success, you're not going to be successful. And I'll give an example, 1792 in Winter Park, Florida. Tom Percival was the project manager for FDOT. We did a corridor study, and their answer was not change the curb, but restripe this road so they can squeeze 6 lanes of traffic out of it. It was a horrible solution. What we said, with partnership with the city of Winter Park, is no, extend Lee Road through this potential development and have the city come to the plate in its regulatory powers to take ownership in the road, not in terms of maintenance obligation, but to contributing to a solution. So if you go to Lee Road and 1792 today, they've actually punched Lee Road through, so the offset at Webster and Lee Road is gone. That was the cause of the congestion. The city of Winter Park stepped to the plate with the zoning and the requirements of the redevelopment of the northeast corner to help solve that problem. And so you need to work at all levels. One is we're not just asking FDOT to do us a favor. We have to look at street network solutions and help them solve their problem.
Absolutely.
At the same time, get the people who can say yes to the table, and then work with them strategically on both ends. And you can do it with FDOT. If you can do it with Tennessee Department of Transportation, you can do it with anyone. But those are a local, well, local being Orlando area, an example that you can work with FDOT and be strategic about it.
Oh, and you did the prospectus for the Opportunity Zone, GAI did the prospectus for
You know who was working on it.
Is that a tool or something that you would propose for JTA, looking at various different opportunities within their design, what I'd call mobility plan for moving people in and around urban core inner ring areas itself?
Well, I think we have to remember that the opportunity zones, I guess the short answer is yes, of course you would. You look at it because any form of financing that you can bring to a real estate development, whether it's TOD or something else, needs to be examined critically. The ability to make the TOD work within the context of the opportunity zone requirements are really largely driven by the needs of the investor. And I think we also have to remember that at least today, while opportunity zones are attractive and compelling, and I don't know who's really had exposure to them, but you know, the system I like to talk about at the same time, a new market tax credits, also very compelling and attractive, all very complicated. And I've had clients that were absolutely perfect candidates and who resisted doing it just because of the complications. So, you know, to the degree we engage with the private sector, you know, we need to have people who understand the benefits and willing to deal with the complexities and perhaps have the patience. I think the more important part of your question is would you use it? And the answer is yes. The more important part of the question is how does it fit into a larger strategy, which needs to start as part of a larger program. And the sites that might be candidates, just in the sense that some of these were candidates, quickly rose to the surface and others just sort of disappeared.
If the just basically indicated that's what the question was designed to do, was to figure out, and you articulate to them, scoring, you know, which of the actual areas are much more ripe for goals.
Absolutely.
And successes for them and ones that they take that.
The only reason I don't get more excited about opportunity zones, really, is because, I guess there's two reasons. Anything that's complex requires education, and education in a sense is kind of another friction. I mean, that's what all we've been talking about is friction. How do you make the friction get reduced so that you get what you want? And the other thing is, it's good today, it may not be good tomorrow. And you know, people say, well, what about grants? What about grants? It's like grants aren't a strategy. It's just an opportunity, hence the name. So these are opportunities. If we can match something as part of a grander plan, we want to get on it and work through it. If we can't, you know, we need to go to other standby mechanisms.
But with that question, Andre, you're hitting on a point that I'm going to make in my closing. It's about a team advising on a strategy and understanding everything that's at play, and not just the obvious things on the surface.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with the prospectus, one of the things that's in there is called an opportunity index that says how many properties within this area have an index based on a whole series of an algorithm of a whole series of things. how many have an index that indicates it's a pretty good development opportunity. So it's all about sort of targeting and getting people directed to the best places and the most opportunistic places for development.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your comment earlier about creating metrics for performance that you can measure yourself against. I mean, there's physical metrics, but there's also economic and demographic metrics, and those things are easily packaged, organized, and then represented in a prospectus sort of a way that the real estate industry or other people associated with economic development can understand those metrics.
And it's already done.
And it's already done. Yeah. So,
I think it is appropriate, this could be misconstrued, I think it is appropriate to compliment Jacksonville for doing this. One of the shortcomings on the Opportunity Zone program is it should have had extraordinary public input and local government input. It did not. It was moderate. It's kind of a failure in the structure of the program. Where the astute and aggressive public agencies and governments have stepped in is to do something like this. And there are examples around the country. There are not enough. And there are only 3 or 4 examples of this in Florida. So the notion that this local government has stepped out and said, here's a resource that we need to intervene, expose potential investors to the opportunities is a very positive thing. We'll see what comes of it.
Sure. In your conversation about Charlotte, you made the statement that affordability was not an issue. And my question is that consciously not an issue, or was it not an issue market?
It wasn't an issue, period. Back in 1999 and 2000, as we were starting to lay out the system, the affordability of Charlotte was through it. They hadn't been scored on their economic mobility, which they're last, out of the 50 major metropolitan areas. That came later. And so this is where we need to sort of future-proof this project. That was a shortcoming of that planning, is we didn't have neighborhood services at the table when we were doing the system. They do now for the silver line. They didn't have it for the blue line or the gold line. And that, I think, is an important piece, is how do we future-proof this and sort of look at the issues today, what are emerging, and we're not going to be perfect. But everything changes and we all can learn. And this is where I said we're students of TOD. It's really students of community building. We don't know what the issues are tomorrow, but we certainly can try harder than what we did in Charlotte in 2000 and really start to anticipate potential things. And this is really working with you and working with the stakeholders at Jacksonville to try to explore those issues and how do we do it. So back in 1999, it was not an issue, so we did a deliberate strategy, and I don't think anyone was doing deliberate strategies back then except for maybe the major cities that it was an issue, as San Francisco or New York. But now every city is worried about affordability and displacement. We learned from that. So I think it's the question back to you, how do we future-proof this project and make sure we tackle those issues and put it in the scope and invite the right people to the table today to be successful?
Yes, definitely. I think Rosa Parks and Gulf Bear are the two that are an opportunity zone. Any other questions? Or? No?
Cleveland, something they wanted to.
Yeah, is there any other questions? If not, I'll just offer a closing, and first of all by saying thank you all for your time here this morning. So over the past almost 2 hours now, you've had an opportunity to hear the passion that this team has for creating a culture of investment, because at the end of the day, the success of this program is really going to be on the investment that happens to make the program successful, and that's only going to happen by establishing a culture. And how we do that is we've assembled a team with almost 30 years of experience working together with a national resume of developing TOD regulations, regulating those regulations that have been developed by others, and implementing those strategies for clients across the country. Now, as the local guy here and your client liaison, I'm not going to stand in front of you and pretend to be a TOD expert, because I'm not a TOD expert. What I am is I am a person who understands what a TOD strategy means, and I furthermore understand what this strategy means to advance the initiatives of the JTA, the City of Jacksonville, and other stakeholders here regionally when it comes to people like Andre hitting the streets every day, creating jobs and growing this market for the greater Northeast Florida region. Next month marks 7 years since Mr. Ford took over the helm of this agency. Mr. Ford has created a culture with the people he's brought in and the approach he's taken of being innovative, being forward-thinking, and being bringing a results-based organization approach to the JTA. As somebody who is born and raised and has made my career in this community, I can tell you that for the first time, the JTA is truly a partner and a seat at the table in sustaining the long-term viability of the Northeast Florida region. This initiative being undertaken, the initiative of the Ultimate Urban Circulator Project, the Smart Corridor on Bay Street, the advancements of the BRT system, that doesn't happen by accident. It happens intentional and with a focus on results. We're passionate about the results that we're seeing, and we want to be part of it through this next phase with the TOD strategy development for the JTA. In 2013, Mr. Wallace came to town and brought the same innovative approach to downtown development that we're seeing, and it's no mistake now that we're seeing downtown development and investment in the urban core, which is really the core of the UTC and the TOD strategy for the JTA, happening at a pace that we've never seen before. So the time's right and good things are happening. And so when we talk about a culture of investment and sustaining that culture of investment over time, we're talking about flexibility. We're talking about a team that understands how to stay flexible in the moment, how to bring collaboration to the table, and how to measure those results at the end of the day to show that there's return on investment ultimately to the public and to the economy itself. And when I focus on the mission statement of JTA to improve Northeast Florida economy, environment, and quality of life by providing safe, reliable, efficient, and sustainable multimodal transportation services and facilities, I break it down in 3 parts in my mind. The first part about improving Northeast Florida's economy. Under Mr. Ford's leadership, the JTA has really become a regional partner in working with the City of Jacksonville, FDOT, JAX USA, in understanding what JTA's role is to keep the economy growing in Northeast Florida. There's been a focus on technology and innovation, which is important in creating jobs. I'm sure Mr. Wallace will tell you, as we're recruiting industries to Jacksonville and companies to Jacksonville, they want to understand what's in place and from a financial and technology perspective to make Jacksonville the place to bring their folks. And not only that, it's about recruiting talent at the end of the day. And the talent coming out of schools today, they want to be in a cool, hip place where technology reigns. And so that's the first thing I think of when I think about improving the Northeast economy as it ties back to the mission statement. The second piece of it is creating safe, reliable, and efficient transportation. JTA is now the largest BRT system in the Southeast. That doesn't happen by accident. That's intentional. Ridership is up. The marketing and the communication campaign is vastly improved over where it's been in recent decades, and that doesn't happen by mistake. So continuing to focus and putting that initiative forward is at the forefront of our mind in supporting the mission as we look at what a TOD strategy means. And so that brings me to the final piece of the mission statement when you talk about sustainable multimodal transportation services and facilities. You don't make money on transit. You make money on TOD. And the money's important to sustain the mission long term. We understand it. As the local client liaison to the JTA, I understand how that plays into the bigger picture of what's happening in Northeast Florida, as it ties into what Ms. Boyer is now doing at the Downtown Investment Authority, as it relates to plans that Dr. Haley and his team at UF Health have, as it relates to what Baptist is doing, as it relates to what Elements Development is doing down at the district, which is going to be a part of this ultimate system. Tying that all together starts and stops with me and the team of experts that we've assembled to serve you guys. We have a proven resume of local implementation on these things. It starts with our work on the River Place Boulevard Complete Streets project. That entailed collaboration and approach with FDOT, JTA, working very closely with Mr. Rogers at the time and his team, and coordinating the BRT stops as part of that project, and making that public realm improvement an improvement that would invite and sustain investment on the adjacent corridor, which the job is under construction, and we're already seeing and talking to folks who have a vested interest in investing along that corridor. That was a collaborative approach through working with property owners, agencies, and bringing all parties to the table and ensuring everybody walks away at the end of the day feeling like they got a piece of their objective accomplished. We are the team that delivered the development strategy for La Villa to the JTA and the Downtown Investment Authority. We worked, I think everybody in this room understands how we worked collaboratively with both this agency and the City of Jacksonville and Downtown Investment Authority to bring consensus to a strategy that delivers objectives long-term at the end of the day. And we saw the level of competition that the city had in the interest to develop the first project, the townhomes project in La Villa. That doesn't happen by mistake. It was intentional, it was focused on results, and we were the architects to help deliver that strategy in a fashion to accomplish the mission of the organization and other organizations who were stakeholders in that conversation. And finally, back to the question of First Baptist Church and the opportunity it brings to the table. That's the big elephant in the room that everybody's currently focused on because of the massive opportunity it brings. But we can't lose sight of all the other good things that are happening. You've got JEA looking to move their headquarters building. That's going to open up another block adjacent to First Coast Baptist property it's going to have a seat at the table. There's a conversation happening about what's going to happen on the current site of the Jacksonville Landing. And so you've got to really understand what's happening there and how possibly micro-mobility solutions could get implemented into that development plan and tie it back into the overall strategy of JTA in serving their transit system. So, understanding how all these things work together and bringing the approach and the proven implementation strategies is where my role comes into play for this agency. We've assembled a good team. It's a team that I'm confident in, and it's a team that is anxious to serve you with this project. We want to work for this project. We've been a part of helping get the JTA and the city to where it is today, and we look forward to the opportunity to continue moving it forward. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.